Hello, this is our third screencast for week number 1. And this first material used to be a different chapter in the previous editions of the textbook. I'm not yet seeing it in this current textbook in the 7th edition. However, I did like this and it's some good background information, so I'm keeping this in here. So this information, again, not sure if it's in the textbook, but I think it's good context for us. So the disability rights movement, if we look to the 70s and 1980s, found individuals with disabilities organizing for political action. The purpose was to increase opportunities for independent and self-determined lifestyles in the wider community. Organizations founded to advocate for the integration of people with disabilities into mainstream communities. These efforts helped to lead to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, as well as subsequent amendments in 1978, the IDEA Act of 1997, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. The new or evolved thinking about disability is that it is not so much a person's impairment that is disabling, but rather the lack of accommodation for them that creates problems. And I think we have seen, if you have been around since the 80s or 90s, you have seen how access has improved in a lot of cases. I remember as a child, my fourth, fifth, and sixth grade classes were in a 3-story building on the elementary school campus, and the only way to access the upper floors for the fifth graders and the sixth graders were to take a series of stairs. Now, that building was originally constructed in the early 1900s. It was a kind of magnificent building. It was a huge building for the very small town I grew up in. However, it would not be functional today to account for all students who would need access. Now, our book does note that examples like this weren't, it wasn't that these buildings were constructed in such a way that there was hatred for people that couldn't access or use the stairs, but rather it illustrates a failure to think about the needs of others. And so we see, I think, in modern buildings, much more awareness and accommodation to be able to allow individuals of all abilities to be able to access all areas. The utilization of social workers to aid those with disability gained effectiveness and prominence following World War II. Historical approach to medical rehabilitation was to quote unquote restore patients to their fullest levels of physical functioning. However, this approach, if taken to the extreme, may leave some with feelings of shame or disappointment about their disability. The new approach, the new model that I think most people work under, is that there is going to be an impairment and to accept it, and then emphasize organizing and working to create accommodations in one's environment for those physical limitations. So instead of altering the individual, alter the world around them. So we change how we think about the disabled individual. The old view, disability is the inability of a person to perform certain ADLs. Problems are located within the individual since they are seen to be caused by a person's inabilities and impairments. Problems facing people with disabilities can be the result of inflexible and insensitive health organizations that may be too focused on the bottom line, using a one-size-fits-all approach instead of an individualized approach. So, now, Chapter 4. This is looking at models of disability, implications for the counseling profession. Now, I don't think many of us in here are counseling professionals. If you are, this chapter may be of interest for you to review. Otherwise, what I just want to do is highlight some of the models of disability in here in the textbook. And then if you want to read on, you can. I don't think any of the homework assignments questions go into this chapter at all, but if they do, you might need to access it, but I don't think they do. So the first one there, the biomedical model. The biomedical model of disability has a long history, is the most well known to the general public, and carries with it the power and prestige of the well established medical profession. This model, rooted in the scientific method and the benefactor of a long tradition, has had dominance in shaping the understanding of disability. The strength of the biomechanical model lies in its strong explanatory power, which far exceeds the explanatory power of other models. Moreover, this model defines disability in the language of medicine, lending scientific credibility to the idea that disabilities are wholly an individual experience. Because of this individualization, privatization, and medicalization of disability, the biomedical model has encouraged investigators to remain silent on issues of social justice. Indeed, this model is not considered to be an interactional model because the definition, the problem, quote unquote, and the treatment of the disability are all considered to lie within the individual with the disability. In addition, interprofessional collaboration is rarely implemented when the disability is medicalized. Underlying the biomedical model is the assumption that pathology is present and, in addition, disabilities are objective conditions that exist in and of themselves. This objectification process opens the door to the possibility of dehumanizing the person because attention is focused on the supposed pathology. The next model, and again, I'm just giving overviews here, is the functional and environmental model. These are considered together in this book because they are interactional models. In these two models, it makes no sense to discuss the definition of disability or the ways in which to intervene without first considering the functions of both the individual and the individual's environment. Therefore, biology becomes less important. Disability is defined in relation to the skills, abilities, and achievements of the individual in addition to biological and organic factors. These models do recognize the biological factors of a disability, disadvantages or limitations such as poverty or a lack of education, although social ills are not considered to be disabilities. Also, although everyone is required to successfully negotiate difficult environments, to undertake demanding functions, and to experience disadvantages, not everyone has a disability. These two models are considered to be interactive models because the disability interacts with functions and environment. Therefore, the definition of disability, the causal attribution, and the solution attribution are not found wholly within the individual. Instead, adherents of these models of disability recognize the importance of biology, but also posit that the environment can cause, contribute to, and exaggerate disability. These models do not view the problem of disability as located totally within the individual, suggesting that many of the difficulties of disability are also located outside of the individual. If the location of the problem shifts, the onus for the solution of the problem also shifts. By viewing the definition, the cause, and the difficulties of disability as interactional, helping professionals can aim interventions at adapting the environmental and functional demands to the needs of the individual with a disability, in addition to rehabilitating the individual. And the last model is the sociopolitical model. This is also referred to as the minority model of disability, is the most recently developed model and, more important, is a fundamental and radical change from the previous models. The sociopolitical model has the capability to explain and describe more of the day-to-day life of people with disabilities. Certainly, for most people with disabilities, the prejudice and discrimination found in the broader society are more of an obstacle than are medical impairments or functional limitations. In this model, people with disabilities view themselves as members of a U.S. minority group. Indeed, some disability rights advocates have described Americans with disabilities as foreigners in their own country. The hallmarks of this model include self-definition, self-determination, the elimination or reduction of the prejudice and discrimination, sometimes referred to as handicapism, rejection of medical diagnoses and categories, and the drive to achieve full equality and civil rights under U.S. law. So that was the extent that I wanted to touch on Chapter 4. And again, they're looking at these models of disability and relating them to counseling services or being a counselor for individuals with a disability. Again, a potentially important chapter, but maybe one that is not relevant to most of our needs. Let's move on now to Chapter 5, changes in attitudes toward people with handicaps. So, key events that have helped change attitudes towards individuals with quote unquote handicaps are things like this. In 1948, General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is an international document that was adopted by the UN General Assembly that enshrines the rights and freedoms of all human beings. Drafted by UN committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, it was accepted by the General Assembly as Resolution 217 during its third session on December 10, 1948. Of the 58 members of the UN at the time, 48 voted in favor, none against, 8 abstained, and 2 did not vote. It was or is a foundational text in the history of human and civil rights. The Declaration consists of 30 articles detailing an individual's basic rights and fundamental freedoms and affirming their universal character as inherent, inalienable, and applicable to all human beings. It's adopted as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights commits nations to recognize all humans as beings born free and equal in dignity and rights, regardless of nationality, place of residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. And the Declaration is considered a milestone document for its universalist language, which makes no reference to a particular culture, political system, or religion. 1973, there was the American Hospital Association Patient Bill of Rights. So this is a formulation of basic rights of the mentally ill and mentally retarded. So among other things, there was this formulation that there was a right to treatment, the right to compensation for institution-maintained labor, and the right to education. In 1972, there was a set of 18 value-laden beliefs and principles published by Wright et al. These guidelines were for rehabilitation of people with disabilities. Presented in the chapter were 7 of the 18 principles. Every individual needs respect and encouragement. The presence of a handicap, no matter how severe, does not alter these fundamental rights. The assets of the person must receive considerable attention in the rehabilitation effort. The active participation of the client in the planning and execution of his rehabilitation program is to be sought as fully as possible. The severity of a handicap can be increased or diminished by environmental conditions. Involvement of the client with the general life of the community is a fundamental principle guiding decisions concerning living arrangements and the use of resources. All phases of rehabilitation have psychological aspects. Self-help organizations are important allies in the rehabilitation effort. So, looking now at manifestations in practice, And I gave an example earlier about how the old elementary school building would not be appropriate for today. There is increasing accommodations for handicapped children within schools. That's a great example. So, getting elevators, having accessible entries for people with wheelchairs, having buttons one can press to open automatic doors. There are things like access and seating in venues. If you've been to a concert or a professional sports event recently, you might have noticed a large number of seats dedicated for individuals with disabilities. There are all types of things that are done when making new buildings, new uh, areas within a city that allow for increased accommodation for those who need assistance. There are parking spots within um, shopping centers, and inclusion of those with handicaps in leadership positions working to advocate on behalf of those with disabilities.